Hello, welcome to the Science for Policy podcast. My name is Toby, and today I'm joined by two guests who hail from the Finnish Academy of Science and Letters, Professor Risto Nieminen and Dr. Jaakko Kuosmanen. Professor Nieminen is the former president of the Academy, as well as an associate of the US National Academy of Sciences and a Finnish academician of science. That's a thing, apparently. He was also a distinguished emeritus professor of physics at Aalto University in Finland, where he was formerly Dean of Science. And Dr. Jaakko Kuosmanen earned his PhD in political sciences at Edinburgh and worked in Oxford before becoming the secretary of the Finnish Academy, as well as an adjunct professor at the University of Helsinki. He's also worked as a political consultant on 5 different continents, helping governments to build new capabilities for evidence-informed policymaking, which, no surprise, is what we'd like to talk about today. So both Risto and Jaakko are jointly the partnership behind an intriguing project known as Sophie, which the Finnish Academy has been running since 2019. It's now in its 3rd and final year. They are designing a new science advice mechanism for Finland. This kind of thing is very much grist to our mill, so welcome both of you.
Hello.
Hello, thank you.
So this is a conversation I've been looking forward to. The Sophie project is one I've been following with a degree of interest, obviously from the outside over here in Brussels. But I think the last time we actually caught up properly on it was at the end of 2019. So I'm very keen to hear about the progress you've made in the last couple of years, especially now you're in the final year of the project. Before we get into the details, perhaps you could give us, Risto, a quick rundown of what Sophie is in general and what you aim to do.
Yes, I would be happy to do that. As you already mentioned, Sophie is a project. It has a beginning and it has an end. And its mission has already been more or less achieved. Its primary mission has been to establish a new permanent science advice mechanism in Finland. And the main driver and the owner of this mechanism is the Academy of Science and Letters in Finland.
Mm-hmm. Why the Academy? Why is the Academy leading the project?
Well, actually, it goes back to almost 120 years when the Academy was founded. And in its statutes, it's written very clearly that the mission of the Academy, the goal of the Academy is to provide science advice to the government and to other actors in the society. This was even before Finland was independent. So this has been in our rules, in our DNA from the beginning. And Sophie is now making an effort to establish this as a systematic way of approaching science advice. We have been involved in science advice, obviously, previously, but more or less on a personal level, on ad hoc manner. The idea now here is to make it a systematic vehicle for science advice for Finnish government.
So it's been more than 100-year gap between the Academy taking on this mission and creating this mechanism. So then what's been filling the gap? How has science advice been happening in Finland in that intervening century or so?
Well, it's a very important question, obviously, and I would like to stress that Sophie and the Academy of Science and Letters is not seeking to replace or remove any of the existing actors and mechanisms in the field. We have a rather wide network of what we call sectoral research institutes. These are public research institutes which have obviously a role in providing scientific advice in their areas of expertise. For example, during the current crisis, our Research Institute for Health has been very active in providing government actual advice how to move on during the pandemic. So we are not building anything which would replace, but rather integrate and synthesize knowledge, evidence-based advice from a wide area of topics, and also providing that as an independent player, not being part of the ministries or the day-to-day government functions. So it's independent scientific advice, integrating over wide areas and relying on a synthesizing effort coming from the best experts in the country.
So that's very diplomatic of you. I understand that these existing players are not your competitors. You're not trying to replace them. So that's useful to know. But then the obvious question is, why add another mechanism? What's the unmet need that Sophie aims to meet that isn't already handled by one of these other systems that you hope will continue to exist?
Well, I think we already evidenced, and this evidence has been clearer during the recent times, that there is an actual urgent need for this kind of a holistic approach to complex issues arising in the society. There's a demand for scientific advice for policy making and decision making. And the Finnish government has clearly recognized this, and this has been one of the impetuses for making this systematic effort to provide a sustainable mechanism for scientific advice. So we are largely responding to a demand, but obviously, as I said earlier, it's very much in the DNA of the scientists and the science community also to be active partners, players in the dialogue.
Yeah. You mentioned that the government was the prime mover, as it were, for the project. And I think it's valuable that you have political buy-in at the start, but how has that commitment been maintained over the length of the project? I know, for instance, that Finland's had a change of government in that time. So how much of the initial political commitment has survived?
Okay, maybe Jaakko, you are the best person to answer this.
Sure. So we got an initial seed fund from the government to launch the project, which we are very grateful of. But they have been very hands-off, obviously, in the execution of the project, because what they wanted to see is they wanted to have a bottom-up science community-led initiative that we executed. However, what we've been trying to combine is both the kind of push model that focuses on agenda setting, science-led agenda setting, engagement models. In addition, we've been trying to build, and we've been building more kind of pull models, needs-based models. And what we did initially, we have run this as an experimental initiative. So we started by conducting around 250 interviews with civil servants, politicians, researchers, heads of universities, trying to understand where are the existing needs and the existing challenges. And so we work very closely in our development with the ministry. So we've actually been working to build engagement models that are helping the civil servants in their everyday life. And that's has gotten very good commitment from them. And also, which has not hurt, is also that the present government has made a promise on evidence-informed policy making, which has given actually mandate for many of the civil servants who are genuinely feel the need for developing new modes of science advice to actually work with us and collaborate us. So they have given a mandate within their ministries and space and actually also resources to work with us. So also the opportunity window has been there, which we're very grateful of.
Great. So we've talked about the role of the academy, your academy, but you also mentioned other partners. So who else is involved?
Our initiative has aroused quite a lot of interest among the scientific community at large. We have collaboration with 3 other academies. In Finland, as you might guess, there are many functions which are duplicated on a historical language-based lines. So we have a sister academy, which is Swedish-speaking, and they are participating in some of our activities. And similarly, there are 2 engineering science academies which will provide expertise, especially on technology engineering related areas. So these 4 academies form a kind of a loose consortium, with Finnish Academy of Science and Letters being on the driver's seat. So these are the main partners, but obviously then there is the whole university community, the university network, academy members and other individuals are also playing an active role.
I guess one of the main aims of having such a diversity of actors on board, apart from reducing competition, is that you have also like a wide pool of expertise to draw from as contributors to the actual science advice.
Exactly. We see this diversity as a strength, and also, for example, in the engineering academies, the industry sector, the economical players are also represented. Not only academics being members of the academy, but other types of expertise is also presented. So we have valued diversity from the beginning, but at the core is the Finnish Academy of Science and Letters, which is very keen on maintaining its independence and insists on really calling the shots on how the advice mechanism is implemented.
So just to add there, basically what we thought in the beginning of where our niche is also that we wanted to be inclusive in our work, and we didn't want to look as simply interest-oriented science advice mechanism, which only narrows the expertise to membership. But we've actually started to look at from the kind of needs-based perspective where there are best scientists, best experts, we want them on board. So wherever institution they come from, whether or not they're members of academies, because the talent pool, especially nationally, is very small. So we need all hands on deck, definitely.
Well, I mean, I think we should probably get into the details of what exactly are the features of the mechanism you've created, which I guess is what people listening are keen to hear. But let's start there with what you just mentioned. So since Finland is, as you say, a small country, albeit no doubt with some very talented experts, does your new system draw on international expertise as well?
Well, obviously, we are very keen on integrating to the mechanisms Europe-wide or even globally. And from the beginning of the Sophie project, we have worked hard to really understand how science advice mechanisms are implemented in various countries.
Yes, so there are obviously links on advice on how to build science advice, and also apart from that, one of the models that we tried to develop is how to what we would call domesticate international high quality scientific reports like SAPEA or ESAC or IPCC or IPCC. There are national mechanisms that are already domesticating these reports, but there are various very high quality reports that the evidence which is, I think, translatable to the Finnish context. And so we worked on trying to kind of utilize the already done research and high quality rigorous evidence synthesizing that is done internationally in the Finnish context. So that's one model that we've been looking into and trying to develop. And in other models, obviously, it depends on partly on language question, but not necessarily always. So we've looked into, kind of possibilities where we can harness the power of the international community. We definitely want to use that. Finland is a very small country, and I always say this compared to say UK Cabinet Office, if it has around 60 to 80 full-time scientists working there, and in the PMO in Finland, there's definitely not that scale of possibility. So we need to be very smart. We need to be very network oriented. We need to also leverage international networks in a small country, definitely.
Mm-hmm. That's logical. All right, then. So let's broaden out. The field is yours. Talk me through some of the key elements of the system you've been inventing. How does it work? What's cool about it?
So I want to emphasize that what we started off is as an experimental initiative. So we got a very broad mandate, and we started from trying to understand the system as it stands at the moment, and then try to build, hypotheses on engagement models rather than structures to begin with, trying to, build ways of work that work, basically. So we've run pilots on these kind of proto models or experiments. So it's very kind of design oriented, very experiment oriented development initiative. And so we didn't really know initially what we actually want to achieve, because especially when you're genuinely experimenting, you need to be open-minded about what comes out. Of course, there were certain side constraints that we wanted to include. We wanted the system to be inclusive, quite open, both participatory in the sense of try to, bring on board the whole entire scientific community in Finland and internationally, but also kind of participation from other stakeholders as well. We wanted independence. We didn't want government budget funded mechanism. And actually we told the ministries who gave us the seed fund that we're not looking for budget funding at all. And we've been lucky and successfully achieving that goal. Also, I think our hypothesis was that the most impact can be made in early agenda setting and early policy design process. So that's our, kind of impact window where we've been targeting our work. And we wanted to emphasize the capability to engage with complex policy issues. So those were the kind of the site constraints or the ground rules which we started working with. But that was kind of the broader setting. So there's been so much of talk about complex issues and how to engage with them. And we wanted to, kind of basically expand from a very narrow question answer oriented science advice logic to actually explore just simply because there's been all of this talk about post-normal science advice or science advice under complexity, but what exactly does that mean and how do you actually tangibly tackle these huge complex systemic issues is what we wanted to put our heads on, and that's what we've been doing.
So I like this very much. I'm really intrigued with this idea of experimenting with a science advice mechanism. I mean, I guess it seems kind of obvious when you think about it, the idea that before you build a new science advice system, you might want to basically experiment with what kind of features need to be designed in so it does the job you want it to do. But I'm not sure that's how things usually work. I have a feeling science advice systems are very often politically mandated. Not to say they're created in a vacuum, but then the idea of starting with a blank sheet and then running a bunch of experiments to gather evidence strikes me as perhaps quite rare, which is ironic, really. So what's it been like to be able to play around in this area, to run an experimental research project about science advice on a national scale?
So I would say certainly that has been very fascinating and been a very good experience from my point of view. I would like to emphasize that this type of a model seems to work reasonably or actually very well in a country like Finland, which is in general built on high levels of trust between the citizens and the government, and also very low hierarchy of between the institutions. So I'm not claiming that this could not be emulated in other countries as well, but I think in this country we have a fertile ground for this type of experimental approach, trying out various functions, various mechanisms, and then selecting what works. And even the political circles seem to appreciate this type of approach to science advice development.
Yeah, because the previous government actually had an experimentation program within the government program. So basically the efforts to entrench experimentation at the very core of government were done at the highest political level in Finland during the last government term. So there has been a build-up of a culture of experimentation in Finland in the past less than a decade or so. So that's also been quite helpful. People start to understand when we come in or when we start working with ministries, and they're very happy to go along with, so let's just do something and let's see where it goes. And let's see if we can iterate something, beneficial, win-win situations from there. So I think the experimental mindset is also starting to be entrenched in the government gradually, though I would emphasize.
Yeah, I should perhaps add that I'm not trying to say that Finland is some kind of a paradise where scientific advice is universally accepted as it is. So certainly we have issues with fake news or systematically trying to build mistrust and so on. And those issues are there, but I would say that perhaps our starting point, our starting level is reasonably strong to build on the open society and utilize the trust elements in the society.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Okay, then, Jaakko, maybe it's time to make good on your offer to get into the weeds about this. Tell us some of the details of the stuff that's involved in the mechanism you've created.
So we've got several different concepts that we've been working on. And I think the one I might just introduce here is what we call the science sparring, which started to build up from the idea of scientific red teams helping the government. Basically, the idea of red teams being that they would test the tenacity of policy design process from evidence-oriented perspective. And obviously, that's something where you start with the idea is that that's a crazy idea that's never going to happen, because why would they want people to come in and there just to kind of be devil's advocates and pester civil servants when they work? But actually, we've been quite surprised that we reframed it as scientific sparring, but there has been actually some red team activities that we've been able to build on. But so basically the idea overall in the science sparring was that we wanted to build a kind of a trusting creative space for a dialogue between researchers and civil servants working on complex policy issues. So kind of issues where exactly the question and answer logic is not clear, and it's not even clear that we should actually limit the engagement to efforts to build on a Q&A dialogue between researchers. So it's more indirect. Benefits can be more indirect, and there's not even necessarily answers that come out from the dialogue. So we worked on very systemic, complex issues. So we worked with several ministries on topics like the Nature Conservation Act, public sector strategy process, and the National Transportation Framework. So huge systemic issues, basically. We wanted to kind of enable this type of co-building of policy through a critical but constructive approach in a very kind of low-key, very informal settings where people would be trusting and actually also open to criticism, but also open to kind of, seek mutual common ground. So it's a very kind of basically a deliberative effort, if you will. We kind of work with kind of exploration of challenge definitions, identification of evidence gaps or evidence quality analysis or ex-ante impact assessment or exploration of policy alternatives. And so I think we, because we've been building it iteratively and we try to see whether there's a kind of scalable model that works with different ministries. And we work now with, say, 5 different ministries. And so far, the model that what we've found useful and seems to be repeating itself in these type of issues is that there's 3 factors. So there's co-interpretation of needs with the civil servants. And secondly, there's a working anchored in available policy documents. So it's actually document oriented. And third is that kind of a facilitated, very small scale forums. So basically, what I want to emphasize is that firstly is the kind of co-interpretation of needs is that, because sometimes there is the discussion that you need to co-interpret the questions that then should be answered to. But actually, what we found is that sometimes it's helpful to take one step earlier. The co-interpretation is actually co-interpretation of the needs within the policy design process with the civil servants by the knowledge brokers. So the civil servants don't always know actually where in the process they will need evidence support, on what grounds and what type of support. So that's the kind of first step. So then you get it really needs oriented and beneficial for the end users. The second is that you anchor it to available documents. That requires a lot of trust. That requires that the civil servants actually open up the design process and give not ready documents to be shredded, basically, but then build up again in the light of evidence. So that requires a lot of trust. But then that is enabled by very low-key informal forums that are facilitated. Because what we need to do is also we need to bring the scientists, by anchoring the discussion in the policy documents, we bring the scientists closer because sometimes scientists can start from premises and very far off. So we frame the conversation to be very useful through the policy documents. They have worked very well. The feedback is, we get a school grade 9 out of 10, basically, from the sessions, from both the researchers and the civil servants.
This exactly exemplifies our aim of actually building dialogue between the science community and the decision makers and implementers. And the other thing is early engagement. So that's what we have tried to do, and that has been in general very well received. And I believe that actually builds on the general strengths of the society, of the high level of trust, the low hierarchy, which enables dialogue and which enables early engagement.
Great. Well, let's dwell on this for a minute or two because a bunch of questions spring to mind. So one question is about push and pull. You mentioned that you're combining client-driven and supply-driven advice, which is very interesting. Thinking about your red teams, your sparers, which is that? Do policymakers come to you and say, we're working on this particular policy area and we'd like your advice? Or do you knock on their door and say, we've noticed you're having trouble with such and such, we think we can help you figure things out?
Yeah, no, this is very much like a pull-based model. So they come to us and say, we have this systemic issue. We've heard that you guys have worked with the Ministry of Environment. we've heard very good things about that you have been able to give them value on the preparation process or the drafting process. And can you help us as well? And then it starts from there. Actually, we talk through them, the process of their design process. And then we ask them questions like, what are the different stages in the process? How is your impact assessment? How is your challenge definition process going? And we try to interpret from there the actual needs, because it can be in different parts of the process, but they don't actually recognize it yet. So it's technically, it's not need oriented. It's first is to establish them a need that they don't actually realize that they have. And then it becomes a needs-oriented process.
It's the selling hamburgers model. I get it, yeah.
But I would like to add there that it's also very important for the Academy of Science and Letters to be not only reacting to a pull type demand. So the Academy is certainly not forsaking the push model also. And in addition to what Jaakko has described as of this science sparring and the ongoing dialogue between different ministries, for example, is the fact that the Academy is actively participating in the agenda setting, picking up themes which it considers important and providing kind of white paper type documents on those, and tries to push them on the agenda, not only to rely on the politicians and other decision makers to set up the agenda, but I believe, and the Academy believe, that we have much to add to the actual agenda setting.
Yes, that's exactly right. And what Risto was saying, so one of the things that we've tried to look is exactly the agenda setting is another opportunity window. And one of our models, we tried to look at how to streamline these very traditional science panels that are, very heavy, take a year plus, which include 15 members, and they're very burdensome. And we've looked how we can streamline basically this and have very robust evidence synthesis that are still kind of timely, targeted, and fit the agenda setting discussions in Finland. And we did this with a small group, with a small team. We did an evidence synthesis on use of digital media by youth and elderly. And we did it very kind of in a co-productive fashion with a lot of stakeholders. And we tried to ask them about their specific needs, and where we ended up is kind of having a myth-busting papers. So we identified myths that are in public domain, in public discussions on the use of digital media, like the screen time myth or the diginatives myth. The stakeholders said that there's actually need for someone to actually do some myth busting on these issues. And then we thought, hey, let's try this type of model. And we just finished the written document, and now it's the interaction part jumps in, and we don't know yet where that goes.
Fair enough. Well, so listening to you describe this system, you've used lots of fun words like co-production and informality. And you've talked about creating a safe space where people can discuss issues with each other and be honest about the challenges they face, and also be challenged to themselves. And I know there are many advantages to a process like that, an unstructured or semi-structured process, some of which you've articulated. But on the other hand, there are also good reasons why some science advice mechanisms are much more structured and take care to separate the different elements of their interactions rather more formally, which makes me suspect there must also be challenges that emerge for you, for your rather less structured model. So for instance, things like political defensiveness, the need for politicians to be able to clearly indicate and record where their advice came from, who said what at which stage of the policy-making process, and openness to external challenge and the need for transparency. And these things kind of run counter to the urge to close the doors and have a free and informal chat. So is that something that concerns you? Do you have mechanisms in place to deal with those challenges too?
Okay, that's a very important question, and I believe that's something that we really have to keep an eye on. I believe very strongly on this transparency and accountability that has to be established, because I believe that if you lose transparency, accountability, you will also lose the trustworthiness of scientific advice. And that would be, of course, very dangerous. I think whatever the Finnish model will develop into, this has to be somehow built in the form of documentation, in public debate and so on. So we cannot certainly go beyond closed doors and chat comfortably with the decision makers and then come out happily together with a mutual solution without being open to the society at large. Jaakko, perhaps you have some ideas on how we make sure that we do not lose the transparency in the future.
Yeah, I think this is a key question, Toby, that you're asking. And to begin with, I think there are a lot of contradictory pulls within the science advice ecosystem. And I don't think that to begin with, these contradictory pulls don't necessarily lead to a zero-sum game, not always within the mechanisms. But also, I think that there is a need for different types of mechanisms that are effectively complementary. And so what you need to explore is, the space that is, already there, that is, kind of occupied by different mechanisms, but B, also the type of space that is not already occupied by different types of mechanisms. And I think there are a lot of gaps. If you look at the buildup of science advice, being built up on different kind of strategic high-level models like the linear model or the co-production of knowledge model, I think we are on the verge of a new strategic model that is being built up, internationally, based on the kind of changes that we've seen with these kind of fast-building crises, etc. But that strategic model has not yet formulated. And I think what we've been also looking with the experimental approach is trying to look at the signals of this new emerging strategic approach and try to kind of hands-on touch and feel what that would potentially look like. I think we want to be on the forefront of things, of exploring that horizon. Where it'll lead, I don't really know, but I think we found some things, very small, granular things that we feel that are new and work, but I wouldn't say that this is not necessarily any better, because what we need in a science advice ecosystem is we need very rigorous, structured, traditional, linear-based mechanisms and also co-productive mechanisms, but I think we also need something new that is still yet to emerge.
All right, well that's tantalizing. Another question. So correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like an underlying feature of what we've been talking about so far is that your science advice inputs to the civil service, or to government officials at various levels who are involved in policy formulation. Do you also envisage inputting at the political level, so giving advice to ministers and so on? Or is that something that other parts of the ecosystem already have covered?
I think definitely we want to also engage with the political level and the decision makers. That obviously, it's not a straightforward thing to establish. In the spirit of inclusivity, we've already established connections to political leaders, to political parties within the Finnish parliament, for example. It also goes through the general media and various types of media outlets where this discussion should be encouraged and fostered. But obviously the mechanisms there are rather different from the discussion mechanisms with the civil service, where you have a rather down-to-earth, reasonably well-defined questions to address and so on. I think, again, in a country like Finland, we should establish a working interface dialogue between the science community and the political circles across the board.
Yeah, and to add to that, so we've been already in talks with several ministers about piloting a certain kind of ministerial science advice dialogues, which we were inspired by Mark Ferguson's work in Ireland, and Mark has been arranging these type of ministerial dialogues, and we wanted to build on that and iterate a Finnish version of that, and it looks like we're going to explore it at the very minimum.
I should say that this issue has been discussed quite a lot in the past, and there have been ideas put forward earlier where there, for example, would be chief scientific advisors within the various ministries. I think that's closer to the British model, for example. But those type of ideas of implanting scientific advisors within the ministries under kind of a political leadership, they have not been realized in this country, and I think there's quite a lot of resistance of putting scientists among the politicians in the ministries.
That's what, like a kind of general cultural resistance in Finland? Or do you just mean now because of the current political climate for some reason?
Well, it's hard to say. I think actually the Academy was some time ago involved in an initiative where suggestions were made to go towards this British type model, but it was very quickly forgotten by the politicians that they didn't want to talk about it. Maybe we should somehow revisit the idea and reopen those discussions. But my recollection of the earlier experience was that there seemed to be no way of going forward along that channel.
Okay. Well, now, the idea of experimenting with different ideas implies that maybe there have been some experiments that haven't worked out so well. So are there any interesting concepts that you played with and discarded, or I guess kind of moved away from along the way?
Well, I'd say I mentioned before the kind of domestication of international reports, and so we run some experiments on some reports, and what we found early on already is that that model is quite challenging. We haven't fully given up on it, but we see that at the principled level it makes sense in every ways. But in practical level, we've found quite a bit of challenges. For example, I think not the least is that because they are basically ready-made products, that even though and even if we would kind of do a separate calculations with Finnish scientists and kind of include an add-on to the international report, it's a ready-made report, and when the end users have not been able to be part of the early kind of framing process and throughout the process, then they don't have necessarily ownership to the product, which is then harder to uptake, basically. So what we found is very practical problems on whose responsibility within the government then it is to uptake the information and pass it forward. If it's not part of a process, then it's much harder to kind of link into it. So that's one thing that we found quite challenging early on. But having said that, we haven't given up on the model because at the principle level it works. Maybe we can find formalized connections that more enforces the uptake of it in one way or another, but we don't know if we're able to succeed.
I think it's also a question about kind of a timing. If you land a ready-made international high-level report on the desk of a civil servant, it may be too late for us to really influence their thinking. So it would be very important also to trigger early engagement in these internationally produced reports and documents. So as Jaakko said, we certainly will not give up on this mechanism. We have been a little bit perhaps disappointed of the response that we have gotten to some of our internationally driven initiatives. But we have to find mechanisms to bring them in at the right stage of the process, not too late when the report is finalized and glossy and so on. It's too easy to discard at that stage. So we have to engage our civil servants, our politicians into the international discussion much earlier.
So we're actually trying that this spring with the ESAC Decarbonization of Buildings report, and which there's a long enough timeline to that. And actually, we found that there's an opportunity window because there's a draft legislation on built environment just ongoing in the Ministry of Environment. So we've seen that there's a process. There's a long enough timeline. We have, identified, the national scientific team that can help us with the domestication from the science perspective, and so we've started those conversations already. And so we basically try to tackle the idea of ownership, of also trying to bring on board the civil servants far before the publication and get maybe pre-publication analysis on what's going to be the content of the report. So maybe that's already sufficient for, creating more ownership. We'll see.
Actually, that brings an idea that perhaps ESAC, SAPEA, whoever are producing these wonderful reports, perhaps it would be an idea to engage civil servants from various parts of Europe in the process of preparing that document itself. I mean, that's in a way is the way that we see these engagements, sparring or whatever you want to call it. So the earlier you start it, the bigger is the impact in the end, I believe.
Yeah, well, there's ideas to explore there. You heard it here first. But yeah, I think like it seems like it should be a no-brainer, as you say, that when you have a really good quality evidence review or whatever at European level, like a SAPEA report, on a suitably universal issue anyway, it should be directly of use to national level policymakers who face the same issue and might not want to duplicate all the work it takes to put these things together. But then I guess the two challenges of buy-in and timing, so the advice aligns with policy priorities and really gets taken into account, has an impact, or even gets noticed. These are things that come up again and again when we're talking about science advice, and I guess it's just that much harder to make it work when one jurisdiction commissions the advice, another one wants to piggyback on it. There's obviously more thinking to do here. Anyway, before we finish, if I understand correctly, you are now at the stage where you want to transition from an experimental project into a more permanent institution in Finland, so a science advice mechanism or a collection of different interrelated mechanisms by the sound of it. So, I mean, congratulations, big achievement. What happens next? Are the experiments finished?
Yeah, and I think that Sophie has been an experimentation platform, a small-scale project-oriented experimentation platform. And I think the second phase will look like, one is that there will be, more kind of permanent-oriented engagement models. But then secondly, it will be a bigger experimentation platform for bigger experiments and partnerships. Basically, the hypothesis should be that things shouldn't be excessively in-house. With the smaller the players are, the more you need to leverage the networks and partnerships. I think that's the hypothesis that the next phase will still build on. Rather than turning inwards and becoming closed operation, it will still be a reasonably open and explorative and partnership seeking model as well.
Excellent. Well, I hope you can maintain the financial security and independence to keep doing those exciting things without becoming too deeply institutionalized. And I have one more question. What have you learned? So when the next country decides to embark on this process of reinventing their science advice system, as they might well want to do, for instance, in the aftermath of COVID-19, what advice would you give?
I'd say one is simply, it's more of a process-oriented, so be exploratory and experimental. And two, also work in close alignment with international networks, because I think even though there's not a translatable, directly scalable models, I think working in close alignment with the international community helps, and it gives you ideas on what might work, or actually it gives you even hypotheses on you can test in national context. So, and I appreciate the work that SAPEA and JRC and OECD and other players in the field have done in building the INGSA and ESAF are building these networks. So work close alignment with these good people of international community. We're much smarter together.
I would like to add there that it's very important to appreciate and implement diversity in many ways in the science advice mechanism. What I mean by that is that, in my observation, the younger scientific community, the younger members of the scientific community, they think about the world rather differently from what my generation has usually done. They are very open to discussion. They want to have an impact. They want to engage in the dialogue. They want to build a better society. So whatever mechanisms are established, I think it's very important to keep an eye on keeping the diversity across generations, obviously across genders and so on. So that it's not only gray old wise men who are giving the advice behind closed doors, but you also engage the younger scientists, the new generations. We have very good experience of this already, and the younger scientists are very anxious to take part in the discussions or take part in the activities. They have a rather different...
And one last advice that I would give is that if you think we can help, please call us. We're always happy to have a chat.
Be careful what you wish for, Jaakko. Well, as I mentioned at the start, I've been following Sophie's progress with interest, and it's really good to hear that you've reached such a successful destination. So big congratulations on that. And indeed, maybe even more so because it's more unusual, maybe. Congratulations on the clear path that you see ahead for more experimentation and more development. In many ways, I think you're carrying an important torch for other countries and other science advice mechanisms. I'm looking forward to seeing and learning more from Finland. And of course, Risto and Jaakko, both of you, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
No, thank you, Toby, and thank you, SAPEA, for the great work that you do.
Well, flattery will get you everywhere. The Science for Policy podcast is produced by SAPEA. We're a consortium of Europe's academies and learning societies, and we're part of the European Commission's scientific advice mechanism. We provide evidence and expertise to inform the work of the group of chief scientific advisors. SAPEA is funded by the EU's Horizon 2020 programme for research and innovation, and you can find lots more information about us and our work at sapea.info. Finally, the rather lovely cello music that's playing right now is performed by Elizaveta Sushchenko, so I shall shut up and let you enjoy the last few bars. Bye for now.